Welcome back from the break. I'm Khalil Charles. Now we'll look at the online news that has been happening this week. And in the studio is Annisa Omar. Thanks very much indeed for joining us again, Annisa. What's our first story?
Our first story looks at the oil spills that have been happening in the Niger Delta. It looks like Nigerians are wanting to sue Shell.
And why not?
Why not?
I mean, it's irresponsible, isn't it? I mean, these spills have been happening quite periodically, and of course they've been infecting the water life there as well. So it's quite right that they should be sued for it. Is that suing going to happen here or in Nigeria?
It'd be in Nigeria, and it's been, as you're quite right, the water spillage has been affecting the quality of water supply for people since 1989, and it's been impacting the community in different ways in terms of clearly the water, but also economically. There's been a shortage of jobs, and for the local people, it's been really international people that have been taking on the roles within Shell as well. So there is that angle as well, and just the environment, clearly, water spillage. We know how tragic that can be. So it's more of what are we taking on? The multinationals and understanding that.
Do they give any reason, Annisa, why this is happening? Do they give a specific reason why these spillages are taking place?
I think it's a bit of both, really. There's not these safety procedures that would be in play in a developed country, as it were. If this
because I heard that the company is saying people are trying to sabotage and siphon off oil, and that's caused the breaking of the pipes. And that's led because they've trying to siphon off so they can sell the oil on the cheap, as it were, and that's kind of led to the problem of having these spillages, But I guess the thing to say there is that the company should be responsible for protecting their area there and having the appropriate security to ensure that people are not able to break into the pipelines.
I think that's one aspect, and the fact that it's a developing country, so you're able to go past those usual safety checks that you would do in a developed country, and at the same time perhaps take the oil at a cheaper price than you would elsewhere. So I think it's a bit of both. As you said, there might be siphoning off. Whether that could be multinationals from other developed or developing countries, we don't know. So I think there's a lack of transparency and definitely clearly a lack of accountability and really looking after the people that are being most affected by these drillings.
Okay, that's excellent. What's your second story for us?
Our second story looks at the Al-Qaeda being in Mauritania and really creating a deal with the Mauritanians in terms of not allowing prisoners to be released at a certain time, and understanding that actually we're going to stay away from Mauritania for a little bit. So it's a bit strange in terms of Al-Qaeda creating a deal with a country.
It's quite interesting because we do know that in that area, the Sahel area, it tends to be where Al-Qaeda have their bases. We understand that the first Boko Haram fighters were actually trained in that areas, as well as the Malian guys who eventually took over and were beaten back by the French in that area. So that's been a hotbed, if you like, of Al-Qaeda activity. And so it's very interesting to hear that Mauritania is making deals, if you like, with them on that scale.
For their safety. So perhaps there's an understanding there that Mauritanians perhaps know more about the impacts that such groups such as Al-Qaeda can have, and creating that intelligence and via their own means and looking after themselves. So there is that argument there that actually just because it's not coming from the US and what have you, it's creating their own defences.
Indeed. Okay, excellent. Can we have another story? What are we looking at this week?
Our third story is a lot lighter. We're looking at Zoe Saldana and taking up the role of Nina Simone. And Nina Simone, as we know, and I really adore Nina Simone in terms of her music, of course, her jazz, her soul. And she's known as one of the icons of that type of music. And we all know the lovely... we've got Life as one of the brilliant songs, and creating really songs that are really part of the movement of the 60s and 70s of not only just Black power, but civil rights. So she's an iconic person for that. And the argument really is Zoe Saldana, who is fairer complexion and a smaller nose, as it's stating, and being able to put on these prosthetics and create, as it's been saying on Twitter, a black face. Is she really the woman for that? And saying, are there not black actresses that were good enough for that role?
I mean, you're probably too young to remember the black and white minstrels in which people were painting up their faces and pretending to be black people. This was outrageous then, and it seems very strange in 2016 that we now have a situation where, again, an actress is having to paint up her face, darken it, where they couldn't have found an actor that was in the appropriate shade and who had the appropriate features. That should have been really what the goal was about. So you can understand the backlash, can't you?
Completely. I mean, given the context of Black Lives That Matters that's happening now, and the idea of the racial consciousness that's happening, it perhaps couldn't have come at a worse time, one could argue. And our last story looks at a Senegalese chef in the US and how he is creating food that is more of a Senegalese aspect, as well as bringing in the New Yorkan food that he eats, and creating these restaurants that are really becoming hubs for Africans in America.
So he's filling his belly basically with the local food. It's part of being homesick, I guess. I think so. Thousands of miles away from that, isn't it? Well, Annisa, thank you very much indeed for coming us and bringing us up to date with those interesting articles. Now, the 28th of February, 3 African male Muslim teenagers were killed in an execution style in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This was understandably caused much outrage and shock in the Muslim community. But there's also been accusations of anti-black sentiment following the scant coverage given to the events in the media. Adama Munu has this report.
Police are yet to identify a motive in the gruesome shooting which killed 3 young men of African descent in Fort Wayne in Indiana. 23-year-old Mohammed Taha Omar, 20-year-old Adam Mekki and 17-year-old Mohammed Tariq were killed execution style on Wednesday, according to Fort Wayne's Public Safety Director Rusty York. The families of the 3 were from Central Africa and belonged to a primarily Muslim community. Last Saturday, the Islamic Centre of Fort Wayne held a day of remembrance for Omar and Tariq. The incident comes amid a wave of anti-Muslim incidents in the wake of the November terror attack in Paris. In November last year, 3 Muslim students from Chapel Hill in South Carolina were killed by what was described as a hate crime. The Chapel Hill murders sparked global outrage and widespread condemnation. The deaths of the teens have also sent shockwaves in other countries. And here in London, outside the School of Oriental and African Studies, on Thursday a vigil was held for the teens. The attacks have been seen within the wider movement of Black Lives Matter. There have been accusations against mainstream media in their light coverage of these deaths. And amongst the wider Muslim community, some are even going as far as saying that there has been little coverage and outrage from within the Muslim community, denoting what they call anti-blackness. Some took to social media to vent their frustrations with very strong accusations. However, there are others who disagreed with this. On the whole, there is collective action being taken to ensure justice. Muslim activism groups such as Empower Change have already begun a petition calling for the Fort Wayne Police Department to conduct a full and comprehensive investigation of the killings. The group is currently promoting awareness of the killings on Twitter with the hashtag #Our3Boys.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
There has been much speculation as to exactly why these 3 teenagers were killed. What's at the heart of this story is that of Black Lives Matter and rising Islamophobia. But for 3 families this week, it has been a case of 3 loved ones having been taken away from them. Adama Munu, SOAS, Africa This Week.
Joining us from Baltimore in the United States is essayist and poet Tariq Toure, and here in the studio is broadcaster and writer Nusrat Lodda. Welcome both of you to the program. Okay, I'll start if I can with you, Tariq, and in particular the investigation that has taken place around this issue. What so far do we know about this tragic event? 3 young men killed in what was been described as an execution type murder, but the police are saying they're not looking for a racist motive, and they've ruled out it being based on race. Do we know any more about that, Tariq?
I mean, I guess I can first say that about a week ago, this is what happened, I think Wednesday, about a week ago, that they actually found the young men slain in the house that they were living in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I want to say for about 3 to 4 days, there was like really complete media silence about it. There was one outlet, I think it's called Wayne.com, and I think that's a local station that actually covered it. But it was the same information saying that they really didn't know exactly what happened. And I just realized that for whatever reason, it just wasn't getting national headlines. And something needed really to be said.
We'll go back to why you believe national head they're not getting the kind of press that it deserves. We'll discuss that in a second. But what has been the reaction from people like President Obama? What have they said about this issue? Obviously, when these incidents happen and black people are killed by the police, etc., there have been pronouncements made by the Oval Office. What has been his reaction?
Well, I mean, like, to backtrack to what you said in the first part, is that to say we have no information whatsoever about this happening, like nothing, but to rule out it being a hate crime, or it being based on racism or based on Islamophobia, is kind of odd to me, because if you have no information, how could you possibly rule things out? I think to the second question that you asked about President Obama, one, I would definitely go ahead and say that there are tons of murders happening all over the United States constantly. And that's something I've had to come to understand as far as like reaction from media and different things like that. What I will say is that I know for a fact, me being born and raised here and having a tad bit of education and understanding exactly how we act around race as a republic, that you're probably not going to get a big fuss about a black body being taken, let alone 3 black bodies being taken in the fashion that they were. So I don't really expect any type of statement from President Obama, just because, we're not really prioritized in the media and in just mainstream culture, period.
Doesn't it seem rather odd that a black president in the White House, but there's been an escalation over the past few years of violence against black people? This just seems a bit ironic, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if you study American history, you'll know that there are class wars, there's racial strife, and much of the racial strife is built off of aristocrats pitting 2 classes of people who are sometimes in the same situation against each other. So what you have with President Obama and all the blowback from him is that what's being painted to regular people on the ground, white people, black people, brown people, is that they're losing something. And the point is that, making America better for everybody, it elevates everyone. And sometimes that means helping people become more, equal in their stances and jobs and different things like that. And President Obama, he's just a symbol of that type of equality. But when you have different politicians, you have different media heads, Fox News, making his presidency seem as if this is the most abysmal thing that could ever happen. What happens is you have a lot of people who are really uninformed that are making decisions based off of that, and they're fueled by hate and misunderstanding, and they're just taking out acts. So we're witnessing people react to an Obama presidency. We're seeing people react to people taken to the streets demanding equality, and they see equality as them losing something, and it's literally them losing their grapples on whiteness, or aspirational whiteness.
That's a very interesting point. I'm going to stop you there and come to Nusrat in the studio with us and ask you, Nusrat, this kind of symbolizes the problem we have here, that here we are, no news coverage of 3 Muslim teenagers. What does this say about black Muslims in the US, or indeed in Britain, that they've been disregarded in this way and there isn't anybody paying attention to these events?
Well, what I think it shows is that, you know, the whole idea of some lives are more recoupable than others, meaning that should that happen to you, you know that you're not going to get as much coverage. And that's something that we as society, and particularly us within the Muslim community, should pay a lot of attention to, and it should invoke that sense of self-reflection, considering our principles and teachings. Now, what it means to be black within the US and UK context would mean that generally, considering the heightened Islamophobia that continues to become increasingly more evident, as much as race, you are held in what's called a double jeopardy. So meaning that you will face discrimination, or you will likely face this kind of selective outrage because, one, you are black, and one, you are Muslim. And within the UK, while we've not perhaps experienced as much as in the US, this kind of conflict as such, it makes us think that should this happen, how should we tackle it in terms of the attention that we're bringing to it and raising awareness of it, and, you know, essentially do all lives matter equally within society. I think that's something that we generally need to take this kind of understanding.
But let's be fair here. Do you think, in a sense, that this has been dismissed because it may have been gang-related? It may have been something which you know, people will look at it and say, oh well, they're fighting amongst themselves, and so there's not an issue to concern ourselves with. Do you think that has a bearing on the way in which it's reported?
I think it shouldn't. Well, I think some people, yes, will look at it that way, but generally speaking, when you look at it from a moral perspective, it shouldn't be. And there are some arguments that people say, oh, that because it's something that would come under, or may come under, the issue of gang violence, or because it's not linked to police brutality, that it falls outside the parameters of all Black Lives Matter. And there are arguments that some people have put forward about this. However, my contention would be, no, it actually does fall within the wider aspect of all Black Lives Matter. Reason being that, yes, it may not be within police brutality, or generally, you know, the movement itself generally has looked at police brutality and law enforcement in relation to killings of Black people. It still does fall within the movement. Reason being that, one, these are Black lives that actually have been shot, but upon that, what attention are we bringing when it does happen? And two, why are we having this little coverage? And as a result of that, is that changing the way that we view Black lives? So essentially, it shouldn't be something that's that's divorced from it. If anything, it's more reason to even include it in there. There is little.
Thanks for that. Let me ask Tariq that question with regard to the feeling that this is just related to gang violence. This is not important. Why are we making a fuss over that? And whether that, in fact, you know, this, as Nush has been saying in the studio here, is related to whether Black Lives Matter or not, because they're not being killed by police officers. What's the feeling that you have there in the States concerning this issue, and concerning how, you know, Black people involved in perhaps in gang violence are viewed?
KKK is a gang. The first militias that started in America trying to get freedom were gangs. I think that to attribute this to gang violence is to be oblivious to exactly how a Black person, by just being Black and being in a certain area, can implicate you in gang violence. I grew up in a two-parent home in West Baltimore, in a very, 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 very rough neighborhood. And I could have been impacted by gang violence randomly, just walking down the street, making a mistake and stepping on somebody's shoe. So to say that, hey, they matter less because it could have been gang involvement, not understanding that they could have been affected by gang violence or the conditions that bring upon gang violence, is egregious. Like, why would you even jump to that conclusion in order to go away from the fact that we have not given the correct attention to this matter? And I think, you know, to write that off, you know, is horrible, because we're essentially trying to find the perfect victims. You know, a lot of prominent people haven't been involved in all types of horrible things in their lives. That doesn't make their death less valuable in the public eye. You know, so when people were again, we're saying that we don't know, that the media, the police department, they're saying they don't know anything. So how could you even mention gang violence? Or, you know, how could you rule out one but then rule in another one? You know, logically, that doesn't really make any sense.
can we make any comparisons with what happened to the 3 Muslims at Chapel Hill and the killings there? Is it useful to make comparisons here we had white Muslims or people of a different denomination, and surely that story did hit the headlines quite heavily in comparison to what we see here?
I would say that, we overall, in the Muslim communities in some areas, we do have an issue with colorism. We have our own issues with prejudice. And a lot of times that manifests itself in issues like these, where you have, Muslims in our own community using the same scapegoats as, racist Americans or racist white people, saying, well, they were dressed like thugs, or what were they into? What did they do? The same thing with with Mike Brown, with Trayvon Martin, with any black person that gets killed. The immediate question is, what did they do to bring death upon themselves? And to say that, or to allude to those types of things, is horrible, because you're not really reflecting on exactly how many black people have died here for nothing,
sure.
For other than just their skin color. So yeah, we do have some issues, in regards to comparing it, but the only way we can compare it is just, the outcry. For Chapel Hill, which was, I was hurt by Chapel Hill. And I thought, even that was a heinous crime. And, that really woke us up to exactly how deep Islamophobia is, if somebody would take these 3 beautiful kids' lives. But at the same time, we have this happen. And again, because they don't fit that perfect victim category, we had people saying, they had, we don't really want to use that picture that they had because they have on hats and they kind of look like hip hop culture. And I was saying to myself, like, well, I have like a backwards hat on. I'm an upstanding citizen. I'm trying to be a good Muslim. So, we want to find this like box of victimhood that we're perfectly comfortable with. They got to be a certain color, a certain tone.
Right.
They have to be a certain piousness. They have to be, in the right place at the right time, so it's good. Instead of just saying, hey, we're going to value everybody that is slain by senseless violence.
Tariq, I want to bring Nusrat back in there. Thanks for those comments. I want to bring Nusrat back in there. What's your reaction to that in terms of, where there is comparisons that can be drawn, or how do you feel about that? What's your reaction?
I agree very much with what the brother Tariq was saying, actually. Personally, yes, there have been different reactions, both from the wider society and the Muslim community. And a lot of the time, actually, even before there were any confirmations as to actually, the circumstances of death and what have you, people were quick to say, oh, they must be gang-related, or they must be this. People generally were very quick to make those assumptions. And generally, when we look at the issue of gang violence as well, this is sometimes used as a means of trying to say, okay, because they're black boys, let's just use that excuse as a means of not only absolving our own responsibility, but because they don't fit, like what Tariq was saying, a specific mold, it somehow makes it almost, to some degree, normalizes this. And this is a problem. When we look at the issue of gangs and everything, gang violence or whatever it is not something that's not just specific to black communities, if anything. Even within our institutions, like he was saying, the KKK is a gang, and sometimes this excuse of, oh, they were related to gangs or gang violence is sometimes used as a means of opiating people from the wider issues that remain very prevalent in our society, and it kind of almost acts as a way of trying to limit people's ability to question why is it that happened. And there were some people, even on my social media site, that were actually saying, how can people compare it? It's not the same. Well, I'm sorry, it actually is the same. The only difference is people's reactions are different based upon race, but people generally do not want to admit this for fear of being called a racist, because in our society, it'll come up against resistance. Most people know that racism is a bad thing. It's not a very nice character to be. And for these boys to be relegated to that, and people just assuming, before any confirmed fact, that they were gangbangers, that they were this, they were that, just shows you how whenever it comes to the life of black boys, or black males particularly, we generally don't tend to value them to the same degree as, say, for example, a white face or an Arab face or people of the sort.
Briefly, Nusrat, how do we move forward? I mean, you've got the debate that's going along. You've got the hashtag Black Lives Matter. We've got the hashtag for our three boys now. Going forward, how are these things going to help the situation? How are these things going to change the situation?
I think moving forward, the fact that this has now come to light, it's been a great platform for people like Black Lives Matter to move forward with this and include it in there. But on an individual level, we can tweet about this on social media. We can organise and talk about the issue of anti-Blackness, not only within society, but also within the Muslim community. It's also helped people, prominent figures, for example, such as Linda Sarsour or Dawood Walid, to even talk about these issues of anti-Blackness, because it is something that pervades even within the Muslim community, because it's become quite, sadly, among some communities, a normalised thing. And until that becomes challenged and until we start accepting that this is an issue and that there is inequality, we can't really tend to move forward unless we acknowledge the problem as it is.
Thank you very much indeed, Nusrat. And thank you to my guest, Tariq Toure in Baltimore in the United States. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the programme. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining the show and you at home for watching. We'll leave you with scenes of the Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe, the world's oldest leader, as he celebrates his 92nd birthday in quite a lavish style. See you soon.